who's joining us all the way from Montana, USA, where it's 3 a.m. now, for which we are extremely grateful. And he's here today to speak about his book, which is called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World. So Dexter has spent more than 20 years in China. He was the China Bureau Chief and Asia News Editor at Bloomberg Business Week. Now he's serving as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Asia Security Initiative and a fellow at the University of Montana's Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. Apart from Beijing, he's also reported from North Korea, Mongolia, and Cambodia. And he also publishes a weekly newsletter called Trade War for anyone who's interested in the very interesting developments happening today on the economic front. So now, due to his unique background, his book also captures a lot of interesting perspectives. I would only wish to highlight 3 of them so that some of the audience members who might not have had a chance to read his book get a sense of the importance of this book. One is, of course, it covers the Chinese economy in a very interesting manner, not just talking about statistics and everything that the Chinese government publishes, but it also captures the human side about what the migrant workers are going through, what the factory owners themselves are going through, what are the dynamics between the MNCs and the local companies and so on, and the government officials, of course. It also talks about the political changes that have happened in the last 6 to 7 years since Xi Jinping came to power. As Indians, I think in many ways we are embarking on a similar journey. Just yesterday, the Lok Sabha approved some amendments to the labor laws in haste to attract or to make India more attractive for FDI. So this is the journey that China has traversed in the last 20, 30 years. So all these things make this talk a very interesting one. I'll now request Dexter to take the floor for about 20, 25 minutes, and after which I'll open the floor for questions. In the meantime, I request all of you to stay on mute. And if you have any questions, you can enter it in the chat box. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, you can also leave your comments there, which will be routed to me. Thank you very much. Dexter, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sontosh, for this for your very kind introduction. And also thank you to the Institute of Chinese Studies and Ambassador as well for this very, very great opportunity to speak today. I'm going to actually try to share a screen here and use that to talk a little bit about. Oh, is it possible for me to share a screen, Sontosh?
Sure, I'll just give you permission to do so.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yes.
I know.
There we go. Yeah. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about, I'll start by talking about the origins of my book and how I came to focus on this topic of, for lack of a better expression, I call the other China of some 300 million migrant workers and about an equal number of their relatives who live in rural China. So we're talking about almost half of China that I really became very interested in during my years in China and decided to write about. So to go back to the origins of my book, it really, you need to go back to the year 2000. I had been in China at that point for about 5 years. I'd come in the beginning of 1995. And in that year of 2000, I, for the first time, went down to a then remote and poor province in the Southwest, Guizhou, which today is actually still relatively poor. And I was working on 2 different cover stories for Business Week. And the first one you can see here, China's Wealth Cap. I believe that was published in the spring of 2000. At that point, a number of years into China's reform policy after Deng Xiaoping, there was growing concern about income inequality, wealth inequality, and the wealth gap, particularly between the coast and the interior of China. And as some of you may know, Deng Xiaoping, the leader who launched Reform and Opening in late 1978, was very clear about the fact that he saw a sort of an unequal development happening, with first the coastal areas becoming wealthy, but then that wealth should slowly move into the interior of China. Well, by the year 2000, we have a new leader, Party Secretary and President Jiang Zemin, and the wealth gap is becoming increasingly large, and that hoped for trickle-down effect of starting down the coast is not really happening. So I went out there to look at a big new policy launched called Develop the West, and they were talking about Western China, the interior here, and about ways that they could find to try to boost living standards and narrow the gap between the coast and the interior of China. Let's see here. That same year, I did a second cover story, which was very much related. You can see it here. It was called The Great Migration. I think it came out in the fall of 2000. It took me back to the same part of southwestern Guizhou, and also to the factory town of Dongguan, just up the river from Hong Kong and up the river from Shenzhen, which at that point was already becoming really sort of the epitome of China's export manufacturing economy. Well, the Great Migration were then already several hundred million strong migrant workers who were leaving their poor villages and coming to the factories and the construction sites to look for work. So during that visit, or those two visits to Guizhou back then, well, okay. So first of all, just here's a picture, a more recent picture of. On the left here, we have, actually this is in Guangzhou, the provincial capital of Guangdong, even further up the river, up the Pearl River Delta from Dongguan. And on the right is actually a picture, a more recent picture of a particular village that I visited twice that year, a village called Binghuacun. So during that visit, I was to meet these young migrants. Here's one of them, Mo Rubo. He was one of the first people to leave this village that I write about in my book, Binghuacun, and was the consummate migrant worker. He started, I believe, near Shanghai. He worked in Ningbo, which is not far from there, ended up in Guangdong, worked in a number of cities. And when I met him in 2000, he was working, as you can see here, as a welder. He had already been out of his village for about 5 years in a Taiwanese-owned electronics factory. Here's Mo Rubo again on the streets of Dongguan. He's with his girlfriend at the time, who's another migrant worker. She was from a different province, but also like Guizhou, a source of many of the migrants going to the coast. This was Henan, she was from. Farther north in China. So during these visits, I found myself deeply interested in what I was seeing, which is, first of all, a very uneven development in China. And in response to this uneven development, probably the largest migration in human history, with several hundred million young people leaving their homes and going to find work in wealthier parts of China. And I really then began to realize that this development model with China and the migrant workers of China were going to play a key role in China's economic development going forward. I had a wise editor at the time at Bloomberg Businessweek, or it was then called Businessweek before it became part of Bloomberg, who told me, these are very interesting cover stories you're doing, and perhaps someday you might want to develop them into a book. And it took me quite a few years, but ultimately that's what I've done. Let's see here. Oh, okay, here we go. This is another picture of another person with the surname Mo. This is in the village Binghuacun that I showed you a more recent picture of earlier, where these migrant workers that I met were all hailed from. They were all sort of distant cousins, which is common when you go to rural village China. And she was a cousin of Mo Rupo, the welder. She had returned to her village because, well, two reasons really. She was back to help her parents with the rice harvest. And the other reason she was back was because her identity card had expired. And at this point in China, as a migrant worker in one of the coastal cities, usually working in a factory or construction site, it was very risky to be out with an expired identity card. You could be picked up by the local police and in effect held for ransom. And you or your friends would have to gather enough money to pay off these significant fines that the police would impose before they would let you out of what these holding cells, which were in effect jails. Something that happened to one of her cousins before. That exact thing had happened, where one of her cousins had been picked up without an identity card, had been thrown in a police cell, and had to stay there for quite a long time because it didn't have enough money to get out. So she is back renewing her identity card as well. That sort of gives you a sense of the conditions that migrants were then facing back in 2000 when they came to the cities. They were very, very, very vulnerable, both to the local factory managers, who were often from Taiwan or Hong Kong, but also to the local police. Another picture from the village that I ended up featuring in two places in my book. One is this village of Binghuacun, which I first visited in 2000, and the other was the factory town of Dongguan. This is a typical village scene with elderly and youth outside these lovely wooden houses that they still have standing in their village today. So even though it was still about a year plus away, most Chinese were actually quite aware at that point in 2000 that China was going to enter the World Trade Organization. The negotiations between the US and China, the bilateral US-China agreement for China to enter the World Trade Organization, had been completed in 1999, which I had covered as a journalist. And that was the most important bilateral accession agreement that had to be signed. So at this point, it was just a matter of some planned changes in the economy, and China, everyone knew, was going to enter the World Trade Organization at the end of 2001. Even in this remote village in China, there was a hope then that China entering the World Trade Organization could help them really develop and transform their village. At that point, they were really hoping that they would get money either from a Chinese investor or from an overseas investor that they could then put into a local fruit or vegetable processing factory. And then they could move away from that subsistence agriculture and the remittances that they were getting from the young migrants who left the village that was supporting the village at that point. As many of you know, the entry to the World Trade Organization was a real seminal moment in China's modern economic history. It really transformed the country in many, many ways. We saw foreign investment jump from $47 billion in 2001 to $124 billion a decade later in China. Literally tens of thousands of export-oriented factories were set up, and living standards were lifted across the country. This is another cover story that I worked on at the time. I put it in here, first of all, because it's a topic that I deal with in my book, but also it's a hint of some of the troubles that were to come that we see in the US-China trade war today. And even then, there was this post-China's entry to the WTO, as much manufacturing left places like the US heartland and relocated to China, there was already a fear that this hollowing out of industry and lost jobs, for example, in the United States, was going to become a permanent thing. And at that point, the phrase, the China price, became popular, and it was almost considered a frightening thing. You would talk to US manufacturers, whether they were furniture makers or toy makers, whatever they might be, and they would refer to the China price, which they found it impossible to compete with, which was mainly based on low wage costs for all these migrant work that was being paid to these migrant workers that were coming from the interior. This is a much more recent picture. This is Guizhou. I put this picture in to show one of the principal ways that Guizhou and the interior of China was transformed was through massive infrastructure development, high-speed rail and expressways, which you can now see throughout this very still poor part of China. They were already talking about infrastructure development with the Develop the West program that I wrote about in 2000, and it just continued through the years, including after the global financial crisis, when China doubled down on a policy of infrastructure development. So this is another picture today of Guizhou recently, one of the many expressways that snake through the mountainous landscape. If you look very closely, it's hard to read from here, but the fact that that big billboard in the middle of the picture is red and gold is a hint, and that is a hint that it is a big propaganda poster. And I believe that had a saying of Party Secretary Xi Jinping on it. So not only do we have the infrastructure throughout the country, but today we have the propaganda as well spread throughout the country. So what changed in all those years from 2000 when I first went down to Guizhou and first started to spend a lot of time in Western China? And I should say I went back repeatedly over the years, including right up until when I left China 2 years ago. And many things did change. As I said, entry to the World Trade Organization really transformed the economy in China. Once cosseted industries were open to foreign competition and competition from Chinese private companies. Many companies went bankrupt. Many other companies became much stronger as they benefited from, in some cases, foreign investment and overseas managerial and technological know-how. At the same time, living standards across the country went up, and we've seen this undeniable achievement in China today. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921. And China has set some very ambitious goals for that 100th anniversary coming right away, coming right up. One is to eliminate absolute poverty. Well, they've pretty much done that. They will have succeeded in doing so by the end of this year. Another has been to double GDP from 2010 to 2020, and they've just done that. And another one is to double per capita disposable income, again, from 2010 to 2020. Even with COVID-19, which has made that slightly more challenging, it looks like they will successfully achieve that goal as well. Part of what they call building a moderately prosperous society in the Chinese Communist Party jargon. So the achievements are really undeniable, but I'd like to highlight one statistic, which I think is revealing when you look at the changes and the lack of changes in China today. When I first arrived in China in the mid-90s, the average gap between urban incomes and rural incomes was 3. So your average urbanite was making about 3 times what they would make in the countryside, the people in the countryside would make. That gap, despite repeated pledges to be narrowed, has really not changed. It's still about 3 to 1 today in China. At the same time, we have seen an enormous surge in wealth inequality in China. China today, and this is not always well known, has a wealth gap which is comparable to what we would see, what is the case in Russia. And everyone sort of assumes that kleptocratic Russia has a very large wealth gap. Well, in China, it's equally large, and probably even more worryingly, it's growing just as fast. It's growing very fast and just as fast as it is in Russia as well. So I talk a lot in my book about 2 legacy policies that date back to the Mao Zedong era, both of which still are alive and well in China today. And they are at the heart of this dilemma that China faces today, which is still a very, very unequal society, and indeed one that is rapidly becoming more unequal. And the first is you can see a picture of it here, something called the household registration. This is like an internal passport. It was initially, depending on who you talk to, it's been around in China for centuries, but really it's modern, in its modern form, it's something that Mao borrowed from Stalin in the then Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had something called the Propiska, which was their internal passport system. Mao borrowed this idea from Stalin and instituted it in China, mainly to ensure that there would not be migration in the country, and that there would be a pliable population of rural people tied to the then communes that would be able to produce affordable, very cheap grain and food for people in the cities. And that would help to drive industrialization, which was the top priority then. Well, with the reforms of Deng Xiaoping several decades later, after the death of Mao, the household registration system was loosened to the degree now where we see, as I said, several 100 million young people leaving the countryside and migrating. So now they are free to leave the countryside. But the household registration policy, called in Chinese the hukao, continues to play a crucial role in people's lives. And that is primarily because it ties the social welfare benefits of Chinese people to where they were born or where their parents were born. And in effect, that is meant for migrant workers that they are unable to access affordable quality health care in the cities where they live and where they work. It also means that they are unable to bring their children and put them into much higher quality and affordable, free public schools in the cities. It's contributed, it's a human rights issue, I would say. You have a phenomena in China today they refer to as the left behind children. It's referring to some 61 million children from rural China who grow up separated from their parents. And that is because of the hukou, or the household registration, which prevents them from entering the schools in the cities. They often end up in these very large impersonal boarding schools that have been created, built around rural China in order to replace the rural village schools that used to be there. The schools are often, excuse me, impressive in their infrastructure, but have a level of teaching and a level of education quality much, much lower than in the cities. The other major legacy policy that I look at, which is still, again, very much playing a role in the lives of many rural Chinese people today, and migrant workers who typically will still have a small plot of land back in the countryside, even when they go to work in the cities. And this is the dual land policy. And what that in effect means is that rural people in China are not able to sell or rent their land, in most cases, at market rates. The land in the countryside still officially belongs to the collective. Not always clear what that means, but what it means and what it turns out to be the impact turns out to be the local village officials are able to, in effect, rezone land from agricultural use to industrial or commercial use and sell it on at market rates. And it's become a very important source of finance for local governments. At the same time, the rural people would be paid typically a nominal fee, very little money, when they do hand the land over to the village officials or the township, the next level of government officials. This stands in direct contrast to the cities, where we've seen an explosion of wealth as urbanites who do have the right to buy and sell their apartments with long-term leases, 70-year leases, and do so at market rates. So this is also a key reason for the wealth gap that we see in China today, this distinction in the land policy in China. This is a picture of Mo Bois, the young man who was a welder back in the year 2000. And this is his then girlfriend, now his wife. They're married. They've stayed in the city of Dongguan, have not returned to the village or the countryside, as many migrants are doing now. And during this visit, which was about 3 years ago, they were facing the dilemma of what to do for their daughter's education. She was just turning 6. It was clear because of the household registration policy that she could not go to a public school in Dongguan. Mo Bois was adamant that he didn't want his daughter to go back and go to a rural boarding school and become one of the left behind children. So the only option would be one of the private schools in Dongguan, which have cropped up to cater to those migrants who do bring their children to the cities to live with them. And those schools tend to be actually quite expensive and of not very good quality. So he was really struggling with that. He and his wife, by the way, are no longer factory workers. They were running a small business with an athletic, sourcing and athletic apparel, clothing, and they had their own label, and they were selling it online. They're working out of the small apartment that they rented. They were unable to, they're still unable to buy, and really struggling to make a living in the city, but in their case, adamant that they would not return to the countryside to live. So where are we with China today? I should note that nowhere in my book do I talk about COVID-19. My book was published on March 10th. I was in New York City. I had to cut short my planned book promotional activities there, although I got a few of them in before, if you recall, this mid-March is when New York and the United States was just waking up to the severity of the problem that we face with COVID. And so nowhere in the book is that mentioned, but I would argue that COVID-19 and the situation that China is facing today in the world makes some of the themes of my book even more relevant. And the overarching theme of my book is that China is facing one of its biggest economic transitions in decades, arguably as big as what happened with reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, when they turned their back to a degree on the planned economy. So what is that dilemma for China today? It is to move from its previous role that has served it very well as factory to the world to a much more domestic consumption and service-driven economy, one that's much less reliant on investment, which had created problems for China, namely an excessive overhang of debt, which now has the potential to destabilize the financial system and the economy going forward. So China wants to move away from that old model. It also has to, simply because the migrant workers of China are no longer cheap. We have a situation today in China where your average manufacturing wage is higher than in Malaysia. It's actually higher than in Mexico now. So that old factory model based on low-cost wages is no longer relevant for China today. So they want to move crucially to a much more domestic consumption-driven economy. The 2-year trade war with the US plus COVID-19 and the economic devastation that COVID has wrought globally has made it painfully clear to the Chinese leaders that they can no longer rely on the spending power of the world to keep growing. They have a new policy they've been talking about. They call the dual circulation strategy. It's dual in a nod to the fact that they know that China will continue to be a trading nation, will continue to trade with the world, but the real focus now is on building up the domestic market. Largely because of these two legacy policies I talk about that have helped drive this alarming wealth gap, China has struggled to lift the proportion of its economy that is made up of domestic consumption or private spending. It's still slightly under 40%, which is far lower than India, far lower than the US and the global average. I think the US is around 75%. Global average is over 60%. I think India is around 60%. So India has only been able to get domestic consumption up to about 40% of its economy. Why is that? Again, because of these policies and the wealth inequality, you see something called precautionary savings. Migrant workers and people in the countryside, because of uncertainty about their future, tend to not spend much. They tend to save a lot in case they have a big medical bill that they would have to pay for, or also for their children's education, which, as we've seen, can actually be quite expensive. So there is this tendency to save, and the flip side of that is a low consumption level in the economy. China, I argue in my book, cannot make the next step to a more domestic consumption-driven economy without finding a better way to integrate these some 300 million migrant workers and an equally large number of their relatives in the countryside into the economy. And in order to do so, they really need to think about seriously reforming both these policies and potentially eventually doing away with them. So China really has two paths forward at this point. I'm hopeful, or I hope that they would go ahead and move much more quickly to reform the household registration system and the dual land policy, lift the spending power of the other half of China, and therefore create a more sustainable and domestic-driven economy. They could do this while continuing, of course, to trade with the world. The other possibility is a much more insular and fearful approach, and we're seeing, unfortunately, some signs of that already. And that means we're seeing in the early days of COVID much greater fears about migrants, efforts by cities to become even more inhospitable to them, in some cases driving them out of the apartments that they've lived in the cities. Needless to say, this will not help China build up a more sustainable economy. So that's the approach we're seeing. The other hope for approach is that they actually finally move to do serious reforms of these policies. I'd like to end just by pointing out that the Chinese government has been talking for a very long time about reforming these policies, at least since Party Plenum in 2013, where they laid out a blueprint to reform the economy, including by reforming the household registration and the dual land policy. Unfortunately, there's been very little progress made to date. So I guess the other side of it is we're seeing a attitude from the Chinese government, which seems to be increasingly inward looking. We, as an example of that, we've been hearing Xi Jinping talk a lot recently, again, about self-reliance, or in Chinese, 自力更生, which is an old Mao era slogan. Rely on yourself because the world is unfriendly. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of those attitudes resurface again in China today. So I'd like to stop here and hand it back to you, Santosh.
Thank you, Dexter. That was very good. Firstly, all the people who have read the book got to see all the characters come on the screen. The Mo family, whom you have tracked, that's a very good sort of technique many authors have used, but I think you have combined it with your whole of China approach. You've brought in the politics, not just the social side of things. You've brought in the Chinese companies and so on. So thank you for that. And you have also highlighted some key parts of your book. So now I will now exercise, what they call the chair's prerogative and raise a few questions. I have detected three tensions in your book. Although you're mainly focused on the migrant workers who believed that they were migrating to an urban city with the hope of settling down there. They're now being sent to these new areas in the suburbs, Tongzhou and Baoding and all these suburbs of Beijing. So that's one tension, I think, which you have very nicely captured. But there are also tensions in the private sector, which a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs thought that the SOEs were retreating. So they invested, they created companies, they started exporting, and now they're facing barriers everywhere. Their exports are suffering because there's a backlash against China. And also, the SOEs have come back in the last 5-6 years, the public sector has been strengthened. And this self-reliance that you mentioned might mean even more of that, that the SOEs will be strengthened. So that is one tension along the entrepreneurs sort of side of things. And the third one I would like to highlight is also many authors have written, and you've also covered in your book, this vicious circle of local governments using off-balance sheet assets, mainly land, and monetizing the land and building these apartments and hoping that the migrants will occupy them, or so that has now come to an end. There's not that much land left, and whatever has been constructed still remains unoccupied. So these three tensions are now kind of finding a focal point in the politics of China. So you have clearly said that for the migrant workers crisis, you see very less hope. But what about the other two tensions on the entrepreneurs and the land economy? That's my first question. My second question was, you also bring in this dichotomy between multinational companies operating in China who manage to audit or pass audits without really complying with the spirit of the labor. And this is very interesting for India because most people expect MNCs to come in and follow the law and not really cut corners. But if your experience in China is that these audits can be managed, and MNCs have not really been kosher in following the labor laws, then really what hope do other countries like India have in protecting the rights of the workers? Do you see a different model, or what are the lessons that India can learn? Of course, India has a very strong labor movement. We have a lot of these labor right activists and all that, which you have mentioned in your book. But what are your thoughts on that? So these are my two questions, and if you can take them, I will now start collecting questions from the audience. And I encourage more members of the audience to send questions. I will try and give preference to people who might not be regulars to Wednesday seminars, but might have come because of the topic also. Thank you. Dexter?
Okay, well, very good questions. Thank you for those. So on the first one, the state enterprise and the tensions between the growth in the role of state enterprises, what that means for private entrepreneurs, I think that's very real today in China. Just last week, we heard Xi Jinping, once again, not for the first time, talk about the importance of private entrepreneurs becoming closer to the Communist Party of China. And I wrote about this before I left China, so it's been going on for a while, at least for 3 years. Xi Jinping has shown very clearly by this point that he sees a much larger role for the party in the economy and indeed for state enterprises. About 3 years ago, when I did my last story on this topic for Bloomberg Business Week, Xi Jinping had made an announcement at the time that basically said to private entrepreneurs, you have two roles, and one role is the traditional one of making a profit and paying your employees and paying your, providing returns to your shareholders. The other one is that you must love, quote unquote, the party. It's now, there's a situation in China today where private companies, if they reach a certain size and a certain level of success, know that in order to continue to grow, they need to ensure that their corporate goals align in some way with the broad priorities of the Chinese Communist Party. And we've seen that with some of the biggest Chinese companies, whether it's Alibaba or WeChat or many, many others. And that's just a reality which is now become very obvious under the leadership of Xi Jinping. At the same time, he has made it very clear that state enterprises should continue to dominate the commanding heights of the economy, but also even have a larger role than before. He's talked about not only integrating private companies with the party, but also making them or encouraging them or ordering them to have a much closer relationship with state enterprises, something they've talked about called mixed ownership. Some private entrepreneurs that I know that I've spoken to see it more as state theft of their private assets. One more observation, or a very timely observation. We saw, I think 2 days ago, a once very prominent entrepreneur in China named Ren Zhichang was given an 18-year sentence in jail, allegedly for corruption. But the reality is, most of us know that it was probably because he had been outspoken in criticizing the leadership of Xi Jinping. So it goes without saying that trying to directly criticize the party and the top leaders is unacceptable, even if you are a very well-connected entrepreneur, as he was before he was sentenced to 18 years in jail. So the tension between SOEs and private companies is a very real one, and is very much growing under the present leadership. And I think it's going to continue to become an issue in China. On the land issue question, that's still very much a real problem for China today. It goes back to some fiscal reforms way back under the leadership of, I think, then Vice Premier Zhu Rongji, who was a great reformer. He pushed a reform that brought a lot of the tax haul nationally back from the provinces and the localities to Beijing. It was seen as an effort to rein in increasingly wayward local governments and provinces in China. But what it did in effect is took away a large source of the revenues from taxes that they had relied on previously. And at that point really set off this growing reliance on land-related sales for local governments. At the same time, the central government asked and ordered many of the local governments to start to provide better social welfare for citizens in the cities around China. And that responsibility in the Chinese system falls upon the local governments. So they were put in a hard spot. Less money in terms of revenue, more responsibility, more expenditures in terms of social welfare costs. And they did something quite natural, which is start to seize more land from farmers and from migrants in order to fund the local coffers. That continues today. As you mentioned, Santosh, there's a very large associated problem of debt. Land is used as collateral to borrow more money. And the investment-led economy of China has contributed to that problem, as has this dual land system. I do not see an easy way out for China. They need to find alternate sources of income for the local governments other than land sales. They need to return a lot more of the profits from land transactions to the people there, the farmers and the migrants, if they do want to create this much more domestic market-driven economy. But that does require finding new sources of income for local governments. They've floated a bunch of ideas like a property tax. There's been resistance to that in some cases from local officials who own multiple properties that they don't want exposed under a new property tax. But there's different ways they've talked about trying to find alternate sources for local incomes. But that is a very real issue for China today. To your third question on the issue of multinationals and dealing with labor law and any possible lessons we might see from the Chinese experience for India in that regard. It's interesting. I covered very closely the growth of a stronger labor law in China, a stronger regulatory environment that aimed to protect workers. China today has a quite strong labor law. Much of it was borrowed from the European model, including Germany. The issue, as always, is not necessarily having the law in place, but actually having compliance or implementation of the law. And that was a very real problem in China. I think in the case of China, and I think, frankly, in the case of India going forward, a key lobby in actually getting implementation of labor regulations has to be the global community of consumers. What we saw in the Chinese example was the growth of a anti-sweatshop movement on college campuses in the US, which then started to put pressure on big listed companies like Walmart, Nike, very early on, and other companies, and said, we're going to organize student boycotts. And they started to actually have real teeth with some of these boycotts, unless you can promise us that the working conditions in your supplier factories in China are good and are following the local regulations. So in the case of China, we saw the creation of a very large labor monitoring industry that sprung up in response to the demands of these multinationals that previously had turned a blind eye to conditions, particularly in their supplier factories. They figure if they're not actually they don't actually own the factory themselves and it's just their supplier, why should they bother worrying about compliance issues? But that became no longer viable. I think in the case of India and anywhere else in the world, you really aren't going to see effective implementation of laws unless the end consumers decide that they really value positive labor conditions, in the products that in the production of the products that they buy. So I think that's really, really important. The Chinese government responded to these outside pressures, I think, in a positive way. They actually strengthened their own regulatory apparatus. They strengthened their inspection regime. They would go and they would punish the multinationals as well with fines if they discovered that in their supply chains they were not meeting the local laws. I think that's all I have to say for now on that topic.
Thank you, Dexter. I think you dealt with all of them. So now I'll turn to the audience questions that have been queuing up in the chat box. So I'll just go in the same order. The first one is a immediate fast forward to the present. What is the economic situation now in China, either in terms of restoration of economic activity, and how has this affected the migrant workers in terms of job losses? So what is your view on this?
So if you look at the first 2 quarters of the year in China, of this year in China, in the first quarter, China registered its first economic contraction in many years, in decades, and this was actually almost heralded by many China economy watchers, because it was so obvious that indeed the economy had contracted, and I think there was a fear that there might be an effort to fudge the numbers, to not admit just how bad it was. But China decided to be quite straightforward and open about how bad it was, and they reported this contraction in the economy, 6-something% contraction. What we saw in the second quarter was a remarkable return to growth. I think it was 3.1% growth in the second quarter. And I think as a former business journalist in China, I should say that we're always very cautious with the numbers. It's hard to know. It's not always easy to know how accurate they are. But what I can say is, and I did this as a business journalist in China, it's important to pay attention to the trend lines. And the trend that we're seeing in China today is a rapid recovery in overall GDP growth. And I think whether it was 3.1% in the second quarter or not, and what it'll be in the third quarter, it is clear that China has quite remarkably controlled COVID and also seen this return to growth. The issue is if you dig a little deeper and look at what is driving that growth, and that's where I have some concerns. And what you can see is that much of that growth has been driven by a renewed emphasis on industry, and that raises the specter of a reversal in progress that they had made on deleveraging and trying to reduce debt in the economy. Well, now it seems as if they've sort of opened the spending spigots. Industry is growing very rapidly, and that is driving the economy, but could create more debt problems going forward. If you look at the consumption side, it's also worrying. What you can see is sort of a bifurcating economy where high-end consumption is actually done quite well. So if you look at SUV sales, or if you look at smartphone sales, or the real estate market for that matter, they've been doing very, very well. But if you look at mass consumer goods in China, that hasn't been very good at all so far this year. And that is a direct result of the impact on much of the lower income part of the population, including migrant workers. We saw, I think in the second quarter, whereas overall there was a slight return to growth in terms of incomes, migrant worker incomes declined by about 7%. That is continuing today. You have an issue today where actually more migrant workers are working in the service sector than they are in manufacturing or construction today. And many of those jobs just haven't returned. Part of that is demand and the fact that people are still nervous about going back to restaurants, going back to different service industry sector and using that because of continuing fears of COVID. And the other side, as I mentioned earlier, is there unfortunately has been a renewed backlash against migrant workers and this fear, this perception that because of their migratory nature, that they might actually bring disease back to the cities. And that very sadly has appeared in sometimes quite draconian responses to the migrants as they've tried to go back to their jobs. We've seen cases where apartment buildings that migrants have rented apartments in previously, they've returned to only see their electricity and their gas and their water actually cut off in some cases in order to try to push them back out. So the question going forward again is, can China move away from this much more, this bifurcated economy and an economy that once again seems to be very reliant on industry and actually find a way to boost domestic consumption more broadly in the economy? It's unclear how easy that will be.
Okay, next I'll just invite Anant Kumar Giri, who's been waiting to ask a question. Can you please go ahead and ask your question? You can unmute yourself. Okay, if not, I will ask Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, who has raised his hand virtually.
Professor Giri is there now. Santosh.
Okay. Can I ask the question?
Yeah, please, Professor Giri, please.
Okay, then.
I think Professor Giri has some connectivity issues, so maybe you could just proceed with Ambassador Kumar.
Okay. Ambassador Yogendra Kumar.
Thank you so much. A very interesting talk. I actually have one question, that because the fact that the Chinese economic growth actually is not going according to script, and the fact that the inequalities are growing so much, it obviously must be causing some internal political debates within the Chinese. I'm just wondering as to what kind of debates are taking place in the Chinese Communist Party, and to what extent these let's say different approaches are representatives of different political factions in the Chinese Communist Party, and whether it is leading to some kind of political struggle as to which particular approach should actually, let's say, triumph in handling the Chinese current Chinese growth dilemmas. Thank you.
I think actually, I mean, I in my years in China, 23 years, we've seen various factions vie for position and push their various policy proposals in the system. But what we're seeing today in China is something different, and that is a level of control and centralization in the Communist Party under Xi Jinping, unlike anything that we've seen in many, many decades. A real reversal of the so-called democratic centralism and leadership by a small group of usually in the case of China, men, that was the system before. Deng Xiaoping, took this policy of moving away from leadership by one in response to the excesses of the Mao Zedong era and the Cultural Revolution. Well, even though Deng Xiaoping very successfully created a system that was really leadership by the small group of people in the Politburo Standing Committee, that has changed under Xi Jinping. We see a situation today where there is just this remarkable level of control under the thumb of one man, and that's Xi Jinping. So I would argue that the factional disputes that were obvious in earlier years when I lived in China really aren't there today. There is no doubt dissension. There is no doubt people that are unhappy with the direction that China is going. I know for a fact that there are powerful people that are uncomfortable with China taking a more insular, inward-looking path forward, which is what we're seeing today. But I do not think that there are actually factions now that can seriously challenge the supremacy of Xi Jinping and his closest aides today.
Professor Giri? Professor Giri, can you please raise your question?
Yeah, good afternoon. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, you're audible. Please proceed.
So good afternoon. Thank you, Dexter. Now, you mentioned the continuation of the registration system, but since Xi Jinping wanted to narrow the gap between the rural and urban inequality, now why is that, the changing this registration system is not within the established political discourse, and given the limited factional difference of opinions is still there, but is there no political mobilization around this entrenched issue of discrimination and inequality? My second query is about the boarding school and the life world of the migrants. Now, you are presenting a picture of almost total helplessness with some pictures of their agency. I would request you to give us some more picture of their agency, not just individually, but also collaboratively. And in that situation, the boarding schools, that is it totally private or is there state support for it? Or even in these boarding schools, is there possibility some creative pedagogical interventions? And finally, in terms of the contemporary India-China discursive changes, now the self-reliance in China and the discourse of self-reliant India, the Atmanirbhar Bharat, and if you would have some thoughts about it and the resonance and possible divergences. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If you don't mind, your third question, India, China, I didn't catch the full gist of that. If you could just very quickly rephrase.
So let me clarify. I think what Professor Giri was referring to was that in the last couple of months, Indian government has also pivoted towards a model of self-reliance, mainly directed against China so that we reduce exports on China, but there are other elements also. So what he's saying is, what's your comment on how China looks at self-reliance and how India looks at self-reliance?
Okay. Starting with the hukou policy or the household registration policy, as I mentioned earlier, there is no shortage of wise people in the Chinese government that know that they need to reform that household registration policy. And they've been talking about it at least since, as I said earlier, a third plenum, a key Communist Party meeting in 2013, where they stated the need to reform the policy, and they've said that they know that they need to do that if they do want to boost domestic consumption. So the relationship between the restrictive policy and their inability to boost domestic consumption is also something that the leadership is aware of. Since then, we've seen really, despite this bold pledge to reform, very, very limited progress. We've seen piecemeal efforts, pilot programs in different cities around the world. And I'm sorry, in different cities around China. And I would say what distinguishes the process so far is it's very much a top-down effort where the Chinese government, with the central government working with the provinces, will designate certain cities that can experiment with the hukou reform and can try to bring more migrants to settle down permanently. Actually, considering where the migrants would like to move, where the jobs are, is not usually part of the equation. So you have a situation where, in some cases, smaller cities that are struggling economically are the ones that now say the migrants can come here. There are some cases, there's smaller cities that are dealing with so-called ghost cities. They've overbuilt the real estate. They have a lot of vacant apartments. And so they're the ones saying, okay, we would like to see migrants come here, somehow find jobs, not explained what kind of jobs in these sometimes economically depressed regions, and start to buy up the local apartments. Again, the question of whether the migrants want to go there is largely unexamined. Some of the biggest cities that have the most vibrant economies, places like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, many of the provincial capitals actually have become more restrictive towards the migrants. Places like Beijing and Shanghai have set population growth goals where they actually intend to decrease the number of people there. And one of the ways that the local governments have gone about it is by driving out the migrant populations. Sometimes by shutting down the small private schools that the migrant workers' children would go to, so that the migrants no longer have a place to put their children in school. So it's very much a top-down effort. Again, I don't believe that there's any lack of knowledge that they need to do this, but very limited progress. I referred earlier, I think, to the fact that one big obstacle to reform is the fact that the local governments are the ones responsible for the social welfare costs in the Chinese system. That means that if a large number of migrants are going to be integrated so that they get the same kind of healthcare and their children can go to the public schools, that's a cost that will have to be borne by the local governments. And they've pushed back against that. And then there's also a real source of resistance amongst those urbanites, people that have the urban household registration, who do not want to share their hospitals or their schools with new migrant families. We've even seen protests in recent years by Chinese city parents against well-meaning efforts by the central government to try to reform the education so that more migrant kids can go into the public schools in the cities. Well, we've seen these urban parents take to the streets and say, go to the local Ministry of Education and say, no, don't let any more kids into the school system. It's already hard enough to get our kids into school. So there's real challenges to moving forward. Although, as I argue in my book and today, I think they have to make those reforms if they want to create a more sustainable economy. On the rural school system today, again, a well-meaning effort by the Chinese government to replace what used to be small rural village schools, often close to where the children actually lived, which is where they would go to school in the past. Also, often very poor infrastructure, rundown school buildings, not very good education. They've replaced that by spending a lot of money, I should say, pumping it into rural education and building these quite often impressive big boarding schools. So often they'll have a great athletic field. The buildings themselves will be made out of, they'll be newly built buildings. The issue is the quality of education continues to be very poor in these schools, and they're very impersonal. The kids are living in crowded dorms, and often it's not a very pleasant place to be. And you see, as a result, a very high dropout rate by rural youth, much higher than in the cities. What I argue is really what they need to do is find a way, and they could do this with the household registration reform and finding ways to pay for education in the cities for the migrant children. What they really need to do is change the system so that the children actually can grow up with their parents. There are all kinds of problems, including psychological problems associated with this left behind child phenomena, where the kids grow up away from their parents. Typically, they would see their parents once a year during the Lunar New Year, when the parents have their longest holiday and would come back to the villages and see their children and their elderly parents. So there's not a lot of agency, I would say, on the rural education side. The most common form of agency by rural youth is to drop out. They say, okay, the school is not serving me well. I can get a job in a factory or increasingly a service sector job, and I can make more money. I can stop being a burden on my family who have to pay tuition or pay the costs of my books. And we're seeing this very worrisome trend of more kids dropping out of school. And that's sort of their response to the unfortunate situation they find themselves in. I don't need to say that China's goal of becoming a much more innovation-driven, high value-added economy is not well served by large numbers of young people dropping out of school, which is what we're seeing in rural China. On the third question on comparing, I guess, the policies of India and China in terms of going it alone or isolation, I'm not as familiar, I have to say, with what the Indian model is or what India is doing there. I would say in China, it's worrisome. We are seeing a return to a mindset, which I teach a course on contemporary Chinese history at the university here in Montana, and we're studying the Mao era. And I see a return to a lot of the similar ideas vis-a-vis the world. This idea that the world's unfriendly, and yes, we have to trade with them, but we'll do it on our own terms. We will twist arms to make sure that the benefit all flows towards our direction, our companies in China. And when we feel that there's too much pushback from the rest of the world, we'll go it alone. I should add as well that this policy of self-reliance in China goes way back, well before Xi Jinping. They have a policy today called Made in China 2025, which is focused to a large degree on building up their own domestic capability in key industries, from robotics to green energy to aeronautics and so on, and is very focused on sort of this going it alone. But we saw this as well earlier under the previous administration of Hu Jintao, and even earlier than that as well. Under Hu Jintao, it was called indigenous innovation. Very similar. They set goals for localization of technology. They tried to break their reliance on the rest of the world in terms of technology. And I think we're just seeing a real intensification of that drive today. I don't think it's going to be easy, as I said earlier. China's technology to date has really thrived based on a free flow of investment and ideas across borders. Their cooperation with global technology companies has been key to their development so far. And I don't see that changing going forward.
Thank you, Dexter. I'll now call Adil, who is a researcher at ICS, to ask his question, please. Adil? We have only 10 minutes left, so please keep your questions short. And Dexter, I would also try and keep your answers relatively short. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. Hello, sir. Thank you for a very enlightening presentation. My question to you was, I believe in March, a report was published that said that both foreign and Chinese companies were benefiting from the use of Uyghur workers outside of Xinjiang through labor transfer programs. And according to reports, a similar program may have been initiated in Tibet as well. And I wanted to ask you, how much of this would you think is due to the demands of an aging working Chinese population, especially seeing that ethnic minorities in China were exempt from the One China policy itself? especially in the context of restarting the economy during the COVID crisis?
Well, yes. I mean, there was I think it was a Reuters report from just yesterday or the day before on just how extensive this labor transfer program has been for Tibetans, and pretty shocking if you look at the numbers of Tibetans that have been, we've seen it with Uyghurs before, as you mentioned, but now in the latest example of Tibetans that have been taken to other parts of the country to work. It also had some disturbing details. For example, how much money a labor broker could earn per worker that they transferred. So it's very lucrative for these labor brokers to move people around. I'm less, I would focus less personally on sort of the economic reasons for this. Yes, China has an aging population. Yes, they need workers in many parts of the country. That's a fact. But what I find so alarming here is, we've seen these very disturbing crackdowns on all kinds of freedoms, religious and otherwise, social, civil freedoms in both Xinjiang and Tibet. And the real open question is how much of this, how many of these workers are completely comfortable with being transferred to work somewhere else? To what degree is it forced labor? To what degree is there arm twisting, if it's not forced labor, for them to go do these other jobs in other parts of China? So that's really what I'm most worried about when I heard these latest reports about the labor transfers of Tibetans.
Thank you, Dexter. I'll now read out a last round of questions. I'll do the reading myself to save time, and then see if you can take a shot at these. One question from Rajdeep is, what has been the impact of development on environment, and how has China responded to the environmental challenge? The second one may be related, is about geographical inequality, which you have covered in your book as well. So as a country industrializes, what can we do to reduce geographical inequality? The third one is about the excess capacity that is building up in China. This comes from Raghu Kochar. If it has a lot of excess capacity, can domestic consumption alone be sufficient to offset the losses it's facing due to exports or the backlash in foreign countries? Then there's one question on Chinese students forming the bulk of overseas education. And now with the backlash against China, how is this playing out? And will China be able to from manufacturing to service economy without these getting come from our YouTube channel from Hamsini? What is your opinion on the Chinese government's collaboration with internet giants like Alibaba or Tencent in developing rural Taobao villages? I think I will close it at that. If you can take a shot at these questions, and I think that's all we have time for. Thank you.
Okay, Santosh, I think I couldn't hear you clearly for just a brief part, but it looks like I caught at least 6 or 7 questions here. So I'll just go through these, and if you want to repeat one, if I've missed one, then I'll do so. And I'll try to keep it relatively brief, because I know we are running out of time. And these are great questions. So first of all, the development impact on the environment. I think we all know that the economic costs have been substantial in China. We've seen it in the reports of air pollution, but also in water and soil pollution in China. And that continues to be a very big issue today. There has been an environmental movement of sorts, in that the population, particularly in the cities, has pushed back against environmental degradation, particularly when it's influenced the quality of living, whether it's air pollution or water pollution or something else. And we've seen the government respond to that positively over the years, in efforts to try to clean up the living environment, particularly in the cities. Unfortunately, in many cases, the sources of environmental pollution, the factories, the incinerator plants, and so on, have actually been pushed back into rural parts of China, where there are also people living, but ones that may not be as capable of speaking out against the government as the people in the cities. So that's, I guess, the first question. On geographical inequality, I continue to think that China's done a very good job of doing this massive build out of infrastructure, which has been helpful at driving economic growth into the interior. But I continue to think that what really needs to be done now is to scrap these legacy policies that would allow people to not just work, but also live longer term in those parts of the country where economic opportunity is or where they want to live, and also the land policy scrapped so that they could actually start to substantially benefit from land that they may hold. And those are really key to reducing geographic inequality in China going forward. On excess capacity, I think it's a real concern in China. As I said, the growth that we've seen so far this year, although rather impressive in overall number, is if you look more closely, you can see a lot of that has been built or been propelled by a renewed emphasis on industrialization. A lot of economists I'm speaking to are concerned that there is going to be a larger problem with excess capacity later this year. I don't think that there is a domestic population that can take care of that excess capacity. I think the reason it's, by definition, it's excess. They don't want to buy it. What typically happens, and this has been the source of trade frictions that China's had around the world, is China sells it at cheap costs overseas and undercuts industry in countries around the world, including, it's been a big issue in the US, of course, with steel and other industries. So I'm afraid that we're going to see probably a growing problem with excess capacity that will be reflected in growing international tensions going forward. So overseas Chinese students, I have my own personal feeling is I look at it in part from the policies being taken by my own country, the United States. The United States, of course, has been one of the very top destinations for overseas students, including, of course, from India and from China. I'm concerned about what I see as an excessively sort of hostile attitude towards overseas students in the US. I think that it's been very, very good for the United States and the United States economy to be a desired destination for students from around the world, including from China. And whereas I do think that, we do need to be mindful in the US of the real risk of technology loss and technology theft, I don't think that the best way to deal with that is to close down our borders, turn down the visas for students that may have gotten into some of the best schools in the US. So I think that's a mistake on our side in the US. The last question I heard was the one about Chinese government collaboration with the big e-commerce companies, including these Taobao villages you see in the countryside. I think that e-commerce has been very helpful in many ways to try to boost development in the interior of China. It's something that the government is very aware of, and they've encouraged. And if you go talk to local development officials or poverty alleviation officials in rural China, inevitably they'll bring up the role of e-commerce, allowing the people there to sell their goods to the rest of China, where the markets might be. And so I think that's very good. I just would say that on the less savory side of it, I've seen is in some of these Taobao villages, I've seen a return of labor and environmental practices or a lack of concern about environmental regulations and labor regulations that I hadn't seen in China since I started covering manufacturing in China back in the 90s. So a lot of these things have sort of been pushed out of the bigger cities in terms of the more egregious labor abuses and environmental abuses. In some cases, those are cropping up again in the Taobao villages.
Thank you, Dexter. I think you addressed all the questions I raised. There are still a lot of good questions, but I have completely run out of time, and that is purely my mistake. I have tried to bring in a mix of questions from very senior audience members, newcomers to our Wednesday seminar, and so on. So hopefully, I've covered a range of topics. And I would like to thank Dexter again for staying up till morning. His time, it's close to 5 a.m. for him. And when I said this is a 50-year-old tradition, he readily agreed to go through this pain for us. So thank you, Dexter. And we hope your book does very well and you will write many more. And we hope to have you back again at some point at our Wednesday seminar. Thank you very much. And thank you all for the audience members for attending this talk on a slightly different topic from our normal theme. So thank you all. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.